Hi, welcome to LizCapism. Time to get serious. When talking about clothing, especially historical clothing, we're almost always talking about it along gendered lines. Everything is either men's fashion or women's fashion. And because this is still very much the norm today, a lot of folks don't really question it. But in this video, we're not only going to talk about why you should question it, but how. If you're not aware, this weekend is the CosTube Symposium 2021, where CosTubers across the world are releasing videos, streaming live panels, hosting Instagram events, and many more things. Check out the link for the full program and the official Instagram account below. If you're collecting badges, which you can collect in many of the events and videos this weekend, I'll let you know where you can claim the badge for this video around the middle somewhere. So without any further ado, let's talk about gender in costume and history bounding. This video is a very brief history of gendered clothing, a brief history of some of the most famous people who defied clothing gender norms, and practical steps on how to shake up the gender binary in your own costuming and/or history-bounding wardrobe. While I will be touching on queer and trans history, and this topic is often especially pertinent to trans, non-binary, and intersex folks, this video means to be applicable to all genders, no matter what. I believe everyone benefits from questioning and playing with gender in their clothing and fashion choices. A small note about language before we start. There are going to be words and phrases used in this video that might be outdated or not in common use anymore. These will be used in the context of the era or style to which I am referring. Please do not take my use of them as a sign that they are acceptable out of that context or that I'm even using them correctly, if for no other reason that some of them mean different things in different communities. Please educate yourself and be respectful. I will also refer to men and women a great deal in this video because we're talking about that division as it was practiced and reinforced in history. But there have never been only two genders, and there have never been only two biological sexes. I'm not currently taking questions or comments on this point. I will, however, link some resources in the description for your edification and enjoyment. Please just consider that every time I use the terms male and female, masculine, feminine, or opposite gender, I am internally using sarcastic air quotes. We're going to do the tiniest bit of introductions to the most basic terms used in this video. If you require more information, may I please refer you to the links in the description as well as the playlist that I have made on this topic. Sex. Sex is a trait that determines an individual's reproductive function in animals and plants that propagate their species through sexual reproduction. The type of gametes produced by an organism defines its sex. Intersex. Intersex people are individuals born with any several variations in sex characteristics, including chromosomes, gonads, sex hormones, or genitals. Though these varied sex characteristics may be visible from birth, in other instances these characteristics go unnoticed by an individual all of their life. Gender. Gender refers to characteristics, norms, behaviors, and roles which were each associated historically with a certain biological sex. As a social construct, gender roles vary from society to society and can change over time. Gender identity. Gender identity is the personal sense of one's own gender. Gender identity can correlate with a person's assigned sex at birth or differ from it. The gender binary. The gender binary is the false concept or perception that there are only two sexes and two corresponding genders. Trans or transgender. Transgender people, often shortened to trans, have a gender identity that differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Some transgender people desire medical assistance to transition from one sex to another, but this is not always the case and does not invalidate their identity in either case. This term is also often used by and for people who are non-binary, genderqueer, and intersex, whose identity and/or physical bodies do not necessarily reflect either side of the gender binary. Cis or cisgender. A cisgender person is a person whose gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. Gender coding. Gender coding is the way that people in a shared culture assign and communicate gender roles and concepts through language, imagery, ideas, and feelings. For example, say you walk into the aisle of a toy store and it's entirely pink. Even if your vision is impaired and you cannot see anything but blurry pink shapes, you will likely know that these toys are made for girls. Pink is therefore a gender-coded color in your culture, which communicates girl or female to you. This is despite the fact that there is nothing inherent about the color pink that has anything to do with girls, women, femininity, or anything of the kind. These codes change across culture and over time. Got all of that? Alright, let's move on. A brief history of gendered clothing. Gender-coded clothing is a tough nut to crack, historically speaking. The estimates for when we started wearing clothing in general are very broad, ranging between 150,000 to 50,000 years ago. Since natural fibers decompose very easily, there are precious few actual garments left from beyond 1,000 years ago. Most historical and archaeological research on clothing focuses on writing, visual representation, and evidence from the tools of textile manufacturing. This is why sites like Herjolfsnes dress are such a big deal. They're very rare. As a result, we can often not be sure when or why people in different regions began dressing in clothing generally, never mind when they began dressing differently according to sex. As far as gender divisions in clothing go, most of the research that I have come across, it seems like the when is much more often discussed and noted than the why. One major reason for this is that with carbon dating and spectral analysis, the when is a lot easier to pin down. But also, this is just a guess based on my knowledge of European academic tradition, but I feel like another reason might be that since gender distinction in clothing is such a common occurrence in even modern times, it didn't even seem noteworthy enough to wonder why. It's like, the people began dressing according to outward sex characteristics. Well, of course they did. Onwards. But we can practice a little historical sociology and make some guesses, yes? Some basic examples might be religion, or social mores unattached to religion. Concepts of gender division are often established or reinforced by religion or social mores, and many people of the world incorporate clothing into expressions of faith and roles in the social order. So it follows that when you have solid gender roles and clothing that expresses your role in society, the two would converge. Another possible reason is colonization. Colonizers throughout history have applied their personal standards of gender on colonized peoples, often in an effort to civilize them or assimilate them as an act of cultural domination. This is why we have lost a lot of the world's gender diversity. And what about human pattern recognition? Humans are great at finding patterns. We're not as great with nuance. So when we see that these people tend to have these sexual characteristics and these people tend to have these sexual characteristics, we go a little hog wild with the concept and it runs away from us a little bit. For instance, I can see a comfort and practicality angle from dressing differently if you tend to have more breast tissue. But when we come out the other side of that extreme, we end up here. However, I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist, and I rely on greater minds than my own to bear out or disprove any of these conjectures. But while we don't have a lot of evidence of when it started in a lot of cultures, gendered clothing sure has stuck around. So when you're making, assembling, and dressing in clothes from different historical periods, you will come across these gender distinctions. There will usually be menswear and womenswear. I am not going to include a breakdown of these differences throughout history or in general, because that's frankly the most boring part of this topic for me. It's also the easiest to just Google. Historical fashion articles on Wikipedia are even divided along gender lines, so you really don't need any help from me on this front. Dressing differently from one's perceived gender has been done for many reasons over the years. Sometimes it is an expression of personal identity, but that's not always the case. Here are a few ways that people have used clothing, fashion, or style of the opposite sex that don't necessarily relate directly to their gender identity. Please note that these definitions are very brief and often overlap depending on the time period and community in question. Also, none of these are synonymous with or acceptable substitutes for trans identities. Crossdressing. Crossdressing is the act of dressing in clothing not associated with one's assigned sex. The term refers to an action or a behavior without specific cause or motive. This term is very broad and can mean anything from wearing items of clothing that are just made for the opposite sex, all the way to attempting to pass or disguise oneself as the opposite sex. Drag queen / drag king. This term could be an entire series of videos, but to barely scratch the surface, drag is a specific kind of performative cross-dressing, which is strongly tied to performance art and entertainment. It is generally not synonymous with cross-dressing because of both the performative and exuberant nature of drag, but also because many drag performers consider the gender that they are performing to be inspired by or using aspects of femininity or masculinity, but are not directly male or female personas per se. People of all genders and sexualities perform drag personas. Female impersonator or male impersonator. This is another kind of performative cross-dressing, but generally one that is more closely associated with theater and in a more subdued style. This one is also just a little bit outdated. Generally, these performers are trying to pass convincingly as the opposite sex, but not always. And when the term is used, it is usually implying that the cross-dressing is not an aspect of the performer's life or identity beyond their stage performances. Shakespearean heroines were played by men for many years prior to women having legal access to the roles. They can be counted in this category. But these gender divides in fashion weren't just a suggestion. For much of history, it was mandated by law as well. We have evidence of prohibitions against wearing clothing of the opposite gender going back several millennia. I'm usually the last person to follow the no smoke without fire logic when it comes to historical legal issues, but seeing as how these laws continued to be made until well into the 20th century and continue to this day in some places, I hazard a guess that the rebellion against gendered clothing has been around as long as the laws forbidding it. In the book Arresting Dress, Crossdressing, Law, and Fascination in 19th Century San Francisco, Claire Sears uses San Francisco as a microcosm and jumping off point to discuss how laws against cross-dressing were utilized not only to restrict and define gender norms, but also to reinforce wealthy white ideas about race, class, immigration, and urban development. These laws were often folded into larger indecency laws, placing cross-dressing in the same category as public nudity, lewd acts, and disturbing the peace. In other places, laws against disguises to conceal your identity were very broadly interpreted to include wearing clothing of another gender. Police would often take advantage of cross-dressing laws to bust underground gay bars, especially if they were unable to find any evidence of other offenses. Equating cross-dressing with perversion or lewdness was not only a harmful and erroneous stereotype then, the conflation of those ideas is still present today and still hurts people. These laws were not just informed by the mindset of those who wrote them, these laws also inform the public consciousness. Okay, a quick aside. The day that I was proofreading and fact-checking this script, it just so happened that the Parliament of Guyana officially voted to repeal an anti-cross-dressing law that had been on the books since the days that Guyana was a colony of the British Empire. While there is much more work to be done, this is tremendous as a victory, and I wholeheartedly congratulate the Guyanese people. Time is long, but it bends towards justice. Despite these laws, and the ones that come before and after, which could occupy many videos, people always seem to be defying them throughout history. Even a minor amount of research into the history of cross-dressing and gendered clothing will show you that this was not a novel or rare occurrence at any time in recorded history. Here are some noteworthy examples of people who have throughout the ages proven to us that gender is fluid and clothing has very often been used to demonstrate that fluidity. All of these people could be the subject of an entire video, and many of them are the subject of large biographies. Also, many of them are featured in episodes of the podcast Stuff You Missed in History Class, if you would like to learn more. The Public Universal Friend, Julie d'Aubigny, or La Montpa, Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, also known as the Ladies of Llangollen, Gladys Bentley, Julian Elting, Kathleen Clifford, Georges Sand, Marlene Dietrich, Stormy de Lavery, who is cited by many eyewitness accounts as one of the women whose unwarranted arrest for cross-dressing or attempted arrest precipitated the protests at the Stonewall Inn. Okay, before we get to the rest of the video, I have a few quick announcements. First, I would like to thank my Patreon patrons who keep this channel up and running in many ways. My Patreon patrons get access to videos in advance, ad-free, as well as exclusive behind-the-scenes content, bonus videos, and lots more. To contribute to my Patreon and get these cool perks, click the card or the link in the description. The second announcement is, in case you didn't know, we recently moved house, so along with much better sewing and filming spaces, I have a lot of bare walls, and they're kind of depressing me. So would you like to help me decorate them? My P.O. box is on the screen and in the description if you would like to send me any cute little things that could brighten up my very blank walls. This one is blue because I literally painted it yesterday. The rest of them are a deeply soul-crushing plain white. Send help and decorations. Last thing. The link labeled Google Form in the description is the link you need to follow to get your CoSy badge for this video. One of my favorite jokes revolves around the term gender fluid and how it compares to gender plasma or gender solids. So in the spirit of that somewhat niche gender/physics joke, the badge for this video reads, "Clothes are non-Newtonian." A reminder that the badges are working a little differently this year because last year we were so popular that we crashed the badge website. This year, a human being will send you the digital badge after you fill out the form. They are endeavoring to send out each person's badge within 24 hours, but these are all volunteers, so please be kind and please be patient. So now back to the video. So with this knowledge of gender-coded clothing and a short history of the folks who defined it, how can you, a history-bounder, cosplayer, or costumer in the 21st century, smash the gender binary with your fashion? Well, As with anything, it can be literally anything you want, but if you'd like to have a framework, you know that I have some categories for you. In order to simplify my language and explanations, I will be using myself as the example and therefore using my pronouns, sex, and gender when making up examples. For the following advice, please insert your own pronouns where necessary. The first technique is simply cross-dressing. In my case, this would mean dressing as a man or dressing in some or all of men's clothing. This is probably the easiest in terms of research, but depending on how far you want to go, it could be easy or difficult to accomplish. There's lots of information about male fashion or female fashion throughout history, and so I would simply do the same kind of research I would normally do, but with a different gender in mind. This is a super fun way to explore more aspects of fashion history. It's that wonderful exercise in empathy, both from modern to historical, and from one gender experience to another. What kind of stuff did men or women wear in a period that you're researching, and why? The reason that this might be a little bit more difficult to accomplish in practice is because gender-coded clothing is often predicated on an average or usual body shape of that gender. As someone with breasts, prominent hips, and narrower upper body, my body type is not what men's clothing is traditionally made for. So when wearing a shirt that is made for a man, the shoulders might droop off of the side, it might be too baggy because it has to accommodate my chest, or if other parts fit, my buttons might gape at the front. If it's a longer shirt, it might bunch over my hips or not fit over them at all. For the record, these struggles can exist even if you are a woman dressing in women's clothes or etc. for any other combination. Bodies are massively diverse and made to wear clothing is not. Mass-produced clothes, like many things in our society, are a regression to the mean with exclusionary results. So let's take some lessons from our historical forebears on how to manage clothes that need a different silhouette. You can use shapewear. So for example, for me, that would include things like binding breasts, padding waists and shoulders. But safety first, binding yourself too tight or for too long can be harmful. If you plan to bind your chest a lot, I highly recommend looking at some appropriate binding apparel. Links below for some suggested shops. Customizing or adjusting clothing. Take those clothes and make adjustments to suit your needs. If I was making one of these items from scratch, I might use a man's pattern and then fit it to my body with mock-ups, or I would start with a woman's pattern in a similar style and make aesthetic or small design choices to make it more closely resemble the man's version. If you're dressing fully in another gender's clothing, but you're not looking to create the illusion of passing as that gender, you don't have to spend as much attention to this part, but I still think it deserves some attention. In the same way that Victorian women's clothes don't look quite right without those contoured corsets, working with the intended shape of gendered clothing can really make an impact on the final look and fit. A quick note on plus sizes. As a straight-sized person with limited tailoring experience beyond my own body, any advice that I can give would be kind of telling tales out of school. I will therefore refrain from presuming and say that you know your own body best. If you need some additional guidance, there are some excellent costubers who have made videos about costuming with a plus-size body. My personal favorite recommendation amongst these is Rebecca from Pocketful of Posies. The, let's face it, very few of you who watched my Child's Christmas in Wales video will recognize her lovely voice singing Cherry Ripe and some other tunes during our sing-along. Along with her singing skills, she has more tailoring skills in her little finger than I do in my entire body, so go subscribe to her immediately. The next category is called gender bending. Gender bending means different things in different communities, but we're going to use the broader, more general term for our purposes. In this context, it generally means using makeup, fashion, accessories, and other things to explicitly subvert the gender binary. So unlike cross-dressing, which still kind of adheres to the gender binary since you're just swapping one gender for another in your clothing choices, gender bending is a little bit more about deliberate combining, juxtaposing, and subverting of gender signifiers. A famous example of this in recent memory is the performer Thomas Newforth's stage persona Conchita Wurst, who performed at and won the 2014 Eurovision Song Contest for Austria. Newforth is a cis gay man who uses he/him pronouns, but Conchita uses she/her pronouns, dresses as a female pop diva, and sports a magnificently manicured beard. The facial hair, generally associated with maleness, and the very female clothing and feminine exuberance of the pop star persona are a perfect example of gender bending. The intention of the character is not to disguise a man in a woman's costume. Rather, Conchita confounds our ideas of gender, and she's magnificent while she does it. New Birth is definitely not the first to perform and confound in this way. The middle to late decades of the 20th century are littered with ultra-famous fashion icons who deliberately manipulated gender expectations through fashion. Grace Jones, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, Freddie Mercury, Lou Reed, Annie Lennox, RuPaul, Eddie Izzard, among many. Some tips for this particular style. If this is something that you want to play with, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun to have a little mix and match party in your closet. It's also, in my opinion, a great on-ramp into learning more about makeup if that's something you're interested in. If you've never used it, start simple with some subtle looks. There are a lot of YouTube tutorials. If you have used it for feminine looks but are looking to use it instead to masculinize your look in a more stage makeup kind of way, there are also lots of tutorials for that. If you love your femme-forward, girly, flowery historical gowns, but want to have some fun with gender, use these tutorials and a masculine hairdo, and bang, you've got some gender bending. The fun thing about gender bending is that it is very amenable to the go big or go home energy, but it can also be something that you can do very subtly. A common everyday thing that you may have seen men do in this category is painting their nails. It doesn't change their gender or personal identity, it just makes them look nice and feel nice. Another category is exploring historical trends in fashion which borrowed from another gender. The most practiced people in the name of gender and fashion have always been fashion trendsetters and their tailors or dressmakers. The list of clothing that started as trendy for one gender and then was absorbed, mimicked, played up, played down, or simply copied wholesale to another gender is endless. In my opinion, the absolute pinnacle of this is the 19th century, where masculinized women's wear was absolutely de rigueur in little and big ways. From the lacy white shirtwaist to the bicycle suit, from Spencer's to top hats, masculine styles made an appearance in almost every single aspect of women's wear. In the dandy culture of the 19th century, the same goes for menswear. If you want to learn from the pros in terms of historically accurate fashion that made the switch from one gender to the other, this is the time period to research. Cosplay. Because cosplay is dealing with characters who already exist in various media, there is some extra baggage that gets tied up with gender. So I figured that this deserved its own category entirely. So let's explore ways that gender and cosplay can frolic a little bit more freely. Dressing as your favorite characters, or even just the ones that you find most compelling to recreate, is a huge part of costuming. And because these characters often already have a gender that you did not apply to them yourself, it can feel kind of limiting in terms of what you can or cannot do with that costume. But newsflash, if you want to mess with gender and cosplay at the same time, you can totally do that. Along with all of the above concepts that we've talked about where gender can be played with in contemporary and historical clothing, I'll introduce to you some terms that have been coined within cosplay and the surrounding culture. These aren't so much rules as they are words to know in order to better categorize things in your head. As always, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you do you. Crossplay. Crossplay is dressing as a character who is already different from your own gender. So, for example, if I were to dress up in a costume that is a screen-accurate representation of Indiana Jones, adhering to the stubble, the haircut, the hat, and the male clothing, this is crossplay. The character is the gender that they always were. I'm the one who's making the switch for the costume. It's worth noting that, similar to cross-dressing, which we previously mentioned, there is absolutely no obligation at any time to pass, either as the character or their gender. If I wore a white cotton shirt, a pair of khaki trousers, and a cool hat with a whip at my hip, there is nothing to say that this isn't crossplay, even if I am obviously a woman. Whether it is a costume or your personal gender identity being expressed, you are never under any obligation to conform to other people's expectations of what a specific gender looks like. Gender flipping. Gender flipping is dressing as a character, but if that character was a different gender. This is a popular form of cosplay and a really popular form of fan art, fan fiction storytelling, and really any other form of art that involves the use of existing intellectual property. Changing the gender of a character is a wonderful creative exercise. How would this character dress if they weren't the gender they are, but were still the same personality? Depending on the character and what effect you're going for, there are so many roads to take in this way. If I were to dress as, for instance, Indiana Jones again, but wear a historically accurate 1940s women's outfit, do my hair, makeup, and style myself in a very female way, but maintain all of those same visual signifiers that I talked about before, What would that look like? We're going to pretend that the nature-nurture debate doesn't exist and that this character would be the same regardless of being raised in a society that definitely treats you different based on your gender. This kind of creative thinking really gets my brain cooking. It asks you to explore the world that the character is from. And similar to fanfiction and fan art, the what-if questions spawn a miraculous number of creative possibilities. If you're having trouble imagining it, browse gender flip or gender swap in front of the character you're imagining. Although, if you are new to browsing for ideas on fan art blogs or fanfiction sites, keep an eye out for quite a lot of not safe for work content. All power to the artists and writers who produce that magnificent smut. I just don't want you to stumble onto it unawares. And finally, remember that these are just guidelines, and you can do whatever you want. Like all of my guides and suggestions, these are starting points that are meant to get your brain moving. This is an invitation to play. Gender in clothing is a subject that I could talk about for several more videos, but I hope at least that this was an acceptable introduction to the topic. Please subscribe to see more videos, and check out the rest of the videos being released this weekend for CoSy. All information will be in the description. See you soon!